Welcome to our latest session in our never-ending series, Learning from Labour's History. You might have seen that we've convinced Kevin to do 4 more sessions, at least, running at least to the end of July, so we're very glad about that. We're also very glad to have with us today a visitor, which is an interesting change to the usual format. This is Roger Ball from the Bristol Radical History Group. Very welcome to Roger. We're discussing today Colston, Churchill, and the rest of them, why we're tearing down statues. We should say that if anybody was involved in that, don't say so openly now. They're coming for you. They've already identified 7 people, as I understand it, and started charging them. So if you were involved, congratulations, but don't say so on screen. Okay, the format of this session is Roger is going to start off with a few slides. As you can see, they're already up there. And then Kevin is going to do another, 20 minutes or so each, I guess. So it'll be great to hear from both of you. Thank you very much, Roger.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to do this short talk. I've done it a few times, as you can imagine, over the last few weeks since the statue came down. But it's important to say here that although that event was momentous, and we're very proud in Bristol to have led a worldwide movement, or we like to think we did, it's been a lot of work over many decades, to be honest, and certainly in the last 5 years, Bristol Radical History Group, who I'm a member of, and other people joined together to form the Countering Colston group in 2015. And just to put that in context, so it's been 5 years of campaigning work. We got, outside of all this, which I'm sure most people won't know about, some people will. But it's very important to understand that where we started wasn't with statues or with names of buildings or anything like that. We actually started with physical ceremonies that were going on in the city. So every year, around the time of Colston's birthday, literally hundreds, if not thousands of children would traipse down to the cathedrals where they would hear speeches about how great Colston was without any reference to him being involved in the slave trade. So we started campaigning around those ceremonies on the basis that they should stop celebrating Edward Colston. So my role in that was I was invited to come in and do the research on Edward Colston in 2015. And I'll talk a bit more about it in a minute. I'm not going to use all these slides because it's a longer presentation, but I'm just briefly going to look at what we call, or has been named in the past, the Cult of Colston in Bristol, which gives you a kind of context around this. It wasn't just one statue. This is a whole mass of physical ceremonies and buildings and schools and a lot of history, which has been somewhat created since the Victorian period. So I'll talk briefly about that. I'm not going to talk much about the transatlantic slave trade, except to talk about Colston's involvement in it and how that was obscured. And finally, talk briefly about what's been a century of dissent and protest around Edward Colston. So if you come to Bristol, you will find out that there's basically 4 major historical icons, and I've put them here. So the top left is John Cabot's ship that left from Bristol supposedly to discover Newfoundland. I say discover, again, that's how it's described. To discover Newfoundland in the 1490s. To the right is Edward Colston, who is a 17th century, early 18th century merchant who became the sort of father of the city. Bottom left is Brunel, and bottom right is Concord, part of which was built in Bristol. But central to all of these icons, and they're certainly the top 2, Cabot and Colston, there's been this organisation called the Society of Merchant Venturers. Now, this is an organisation of elite merchants that was formed in the 16th century. So they've been around for more than 500 years, but they got the Royal Charter in 1552. And that organisation, amazingly, because it was central to the organisation of slavery and slave trade in Bristol, still exists. So when I first came to Bristol nearly 40 years ago, I was quite astounded that an organisation that was so closely involved in transatlantic slave trade was still in existence and still had significant civic, political and economic power in the city as a group of elite businessmen. So this is the narrative that most Bristolians would have come across. It was actually created around 150 years after Colston died. So Colston was a philanthropist, and he did give a lot of money to Bristol, but he wasn't the only philanthropist. He certainly wasn't the one that gave the most money. But he was picked out in the Victorian period by a group of businessmen around the merchant venturers who decided they needed an icon for the city. And there are various reasons for that. I won't go into the details of why they did that, but part of that was to do with labour unrest, certainly in the latter part of the century. So they kind of they put forward the story about him as being a philanthropist, that he supported a school, which is basically one public school. It was meant to be a school for poor boys, but ended up for the middle class kids. And it's now a private school called Colston's. The hospitals are another name for schools back in the 17th century. A few almshouses, some churches. And so he supported these things through his wealth. But more importantly, he was recreated as these two figures in the 19th century. This is late Victorian, mid to late Victorian period. And these are the two kind of representations of Colston that were created at the time. One was that he was a merchant prince. I mean, it suited the Victorian businessmen. They created the idea that he was a self-made man, which is ridiculous. He wasn't. He came from a very wealthy and powerful family. He was an international trader, which suited their aims, and he was a member of the Society of Merchant Venturers. He also had another aspect they created, was the idea of the moral saint. He was a devout Christian himself. In fact, I'd call him a Christian fundamentalist. He was, many other people have called him a religious bigot. He was very kind of conservative member of what became the Anglican Church. But they turned him round into this good Samaritan figure. So that's the kind of impression that most people have. They wouldn't know anything else than that until maybe certainly that was hidden in the 19th century. His other involvement in other things, but this is the impression that most people have. So that was called in the 1920s by a dissenting writer, the Cult of Colston. And you can see here, it's like all these schools were named after him, streets, statues, portraits, buildings, objects. There's even religious iconography, like the merchant venturers have got his hair and nails, which they kind of supposedly worship each year. There's lots of symbols, there's flowers, there's dolphins. They all represent Colston. Institutions named after him, organisations that still exist, and 4 or 5 societies. But more importantly, I mean, look around this picture here, if you can see it. I mean, this is a parade that used to happen every year of the merchant venturers. Looks like something out of an away day for Downton Abbey or something. that was happening up till 2016, 2017. Here you can see the Colston bun down the bottom right here, Colston Tower, there's various memorials. This is the Bristol University logo, you can see here. There's the dolphin, which represents Colston, the Colston Hall. Anyway, blah, 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 there's lots of it. But the key thing for us, and was very important, was the fact these physical ceremonies were still going on. So, as I said, there was a period in November each year, it sort of lasts from about the 1st to the 13th of November, when a whole load of events historically went on in the Victorian period, parades, and they gave the working class a day off, which was called Colston Day. They did all sorts of events, but also these carried on, these kind of events and banquets right the way through. Although they lessened their public appeal, they were still going on in the Colston schools right up until 2017. And the key moment for us as a group was when an investigative journalist got into the cathedral and filmed one of the events secretly and heard the bishop telling all these school children, this was in 2014, that Colston was a great man, and there was some kind of speculation about his business interests, but it was merely speculation, which was like a red rag to a bull to a number of people. A local teacher who saw this video was put online of him saying that as a news items about it, but a local teacher was so incensed about this that they were still refusing to tell the real history of Colston to the children, and they were even bringing that into question. She reported the bishop to the Archbishop of Canterbury for telling lies, falsities, and then came to the Bristol Radical History Group and asked us to investigate Colston, and that became what became eventually the Countering Colston campaign. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but just to say that Colston's an interesting figure because If you don't know, prior to 1698, the slave trade, the British slave trade, was basically controlled by one company. One organisation had a monopoly, and that was the Royal African Company. After 1698, it's a free-for-all for merchants. So Colston's was involved in the slave trade in its earlier phase, when there was one company running the whole thing. And so let's just quickly, the hidden history of Colston, which we've been exposing, along with other people over many years, but certainly more specifically over the last 5. The first thing to say was that he came from this mere merchant dynasty. The mere merchants were the most powerful, elite international traders in ports. They were called mere merchants. It's like a closed shop, and that's what the side merchant venturers did. Colston therefore was set up to join the economic elite who ran the Royal African Company. To give you an idea what that size of the number of people who actually had shares and control over the Royal African Company, it's around 200 people. So about 200 people were investing and running the slave trade in the 17th century. And of those, the biggest shareholders, the most important shareholders, became the kind of executives. There were about 24 of them. And Colston immediately became an executive because he was in the top 5% of investors. So these 24 executives, or assistants as they were known, they ran the whole of the British slave trade, basically. And above them was a governor and a sub-governor. So there were kind of 26 people running the whole of the British slave trade at the time. So they did things, you could make money. I mean, people were making money out of shares and dividends. Colston made money out of obviously selling commodities to the Royal African Company. They were hiring ships from many traders. He was lending money to the company, so he made a fortune out of it. Just to give you an idea about the human cost, which was unknown until we did the work in 2015. But during the period that Colston was running or helping to run the British slave trade, 84,000 West Africans were transported, and around 20,000 died on the trip. And that included many women and children down to the age of about 6 years old. After he'd left the Royal African Company, he got back into the slave trade later on through the South Sea Company. I won't go into that in too much detail, but again, the period he was involved in that, another 16,000 West Africans were transported on South Sea Company ships, of which around 3,000 died. The other aspect of Colston that was hidden by his kind of his supporters particularly in the Victorian period, but even right up till now, was because they created the idea that he was this great philanthropist, that in some way that he was giving to everybody in the city. Well, Colston was absolutely not giving to everybody. Every single piece of money that he gave away was kind of predicated on his religious and political bigotry. So basically, if you weren't in the Church of England, you got nothing. And he was quite happy. He said openly, I'll take food out of the hands of children and clothes off their back if they're dissenters, Catholics, or anybody who's not in the Church of England. And even within the Church of England, he would also restrict what he gave away because they had to be in the more fundamentalist sections of the Church of England to get the money. Let alone his hatred for the Whigs. He was a high Tory, so he made sure they didn't get any money either. So basically, his philanthropy was very selective, and that's been hidden purposely because of this image of him as city father. You can't have a city father that only gives half the city the money. He's also an MP for Bristol. But anyway, that's a kind of hidden history. There's a lot more to it than that. But fundamentally, not only was Colston an investor in the slave trade, but he organised it at a top level. He became the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, the second in command of the whole British slave trade at the end of the 1680s. This is quickly to say that this awareness of Colston and dissent around Colston has really been around for about 100 years in Bristol. So famously, I won't talk about the abolition movement in particular, because obviously there was dissent there, but it only became, you remember that he's created as city father a long time after the abolition of slavery. So in the 1920s, a local reverend basically did a job on him, investigated him, exposed his links to the slave trade in a book and his religious bigotry, and put that out. He wasn't popular amongst the merchant elite for doing, the business elite for doing that, but he did it. I can see why he did it, because he was kind of fed up. He's the one who coined the word Cult of Colston. His argument was very simple, was that this Colston figure was not only being massively over memorialized and given such a high status, and there was all this hidden history, but also the fact that he listed 70 Bristolians who should be celebrated instead of Colston. So he saw the cult of Colston as suppressing the memorialization and the history of other people who did much better things than Colston did. Again, there were periods throughout certainly the 20th century where Colston's sort of connections with slavery, and famously in this book, The Shocking History of Bristol in 1973, written by a Bristolian, Derek Robinson, who exposed Colston didn't pull his punches. There's been also lots of protest over the years, not just around Edward Colston, but particularly around the fact that there was very little memorialization either of West African enslaved peoples and their suffering in the slave trade, or of the abolitionists or anybody who stood against slavery. So there were periods through the 1996 Festival of the Sea, and books were published, Abolition 200 period, 200th abolition of the celebration of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007. And each time these events happened, although there were, Festival of the Sea tried to obscure slavery altogether. It was a massive festival put together by the merchant venturers. At each of these points, there were protests and attempts to try and get a key thing, which was a memorialization, a memorial to those who suffered in the transatlantic slave trade. And each of these points, the city council and businessmen were not interested. It floundered, nothing happened. So Bristol is seen across the sort of memorial landscape of Europe in particular as being one of the worst cities for failing to recognize the transatlantic slave trade. And that's true right up until now, and the statue being pulled down. So, for example, Liverpool, done some great work with the Transatlantic Slavery Museum. Nantes in France, brilliant memorial, 2,000 plaques for every single ship that went out, huge memorial. So there's been, some really great examples of attempts to try and deal with this history and open it up. So the result in Bristol, of course, was over the years, there were all sorts of other kinds of things that went on, direct action in particular. I mean, that statue's been, graffitied many times as, he's got a white face here, he's had a manacle put on him, unofficial plaques were continually put up by artists, and massive attack down the left-hand corner, famously refused to play at the Colston Hall, and, also protested around the sort of Festival of the Sea. And so loads of people refused to go to these venues. I mean, they haven't played there, although they're obviously a really famous, world-famous band. So all sorts of stuff went on over the years. And then I pointed out in 2015, Countering Colston was formed. After that, what the bishop's comments in the church, and I won't go about it too much to say, but we were an older group. We'd been through cycles of protest in the past and seen failures, both memorialization failures and failures to deal with the history. So we weren't, green to this, let's put it that way. And we thought a lot about the arguments, and our basic mantra in Countering Colston was enter into the public domain, put the history out, and start to argue, and don't run away from any arguments that are thrown at you by the opposition. And I know that Kevin's going to talk a little bit more later on about things like emotion and ideology, which I think are quite important, and tradition, because we were always confronted with many arguments about erasing history and tradition and stuff like that, and we can talk about that a bit later. But our general rule was into the lion's den. We're not going to stay in a nice liberal bubble. We're going to go out and take the opposition on, which we did. And through lots and lots of work over those years, I think we've managed to help change public opinion and open up the history. This is just an example of some of the protests that went on. So it wasn't just in the newspapers or the local media that we intervened, sometimes in the national media, but it also involved confronting the physical ceremonies, which happened numerous times. And confronting the academy schools that were involved in some of those pushing use. The merchant venturers had taken over a number of schools with the academisation. So they didn't just control private schools, they controlled public-private finance initiatives like academy schools as well, and were forcing their children to go and celebrate Colston. So we had a number of, I'll ignore this slide, but this is us analysing the arguments that were going on in the local newspapers, isolating the different kinds of arguments and starting to counter them. But we had a lot of victories, not only by exposing the history, but starting the debate. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't an easy ride. I won't go into all the ins and outs of it, but it was a nasty fight. So involved from day one, we were accused in the national press of harassing school children. Lies were told about us. That we were on the first protest. We were in the Daily Mail, the Sun, and the Daily Telegraph for supposedly holding a demonstration at the school, which we never did ever. So we were told we were doing. Literally, we were told we were child abusers. That's not a good start to a campaign, to be honest. And that continued with threats to us. We were denounced to the National Adjudicator for Education for being terrorists by the merchant venturers. They tried to get us in the Prevent program onto us, all sorts of stuff that was really nasty. Court cases went ahead. We won every time, and they backed off eventually a few years ago, and loads of them resigned as a result. But it wasn't nice, let's put it that way. So just some ideas about victories, because I'm running out of time, but basically the commemorations are pretty much stopped now. Most of the events that occurred that were going on for sometimes for hundreds of years have stopped. The Colston Hall was renamed. Colston became effectively a toxic brand. Several schools that were state schools that had his name, did consultations and changed their names, though the private schools and some of the academy schools that are under the control of the merchant ventures have kept their names. Buildings like the Colston Tower we've seen recently change, was the statue came down eventually. But we've had an influence throughout this process, which started a few years ago and has famously ended with the statue coming down. The last thing I want to say about this is, because I'm finishing now, is that for us it was never a question of removing things or just changing or taking names away. It was always a process of looking towards opening the history up and starting to think about the people who should be memorialised. And that's what's going on at the moment, is a debate about who should be remembered in Bristol's history. And that's really important. And also centrally, the fact that, the city hasn't got a proper memorial or a proper museum to deal with Bristol and its involvement in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And we've been fighting hard over the years to try and get that. And it's been a difficult fight, even with, the first black elected mayor in the city, person of African Caribbean descent, in the country, I believe. We've had real problems pushing this forward, surprisingly. But it's very important to understand that this is not a negative campaign, it's a positive campaign about who do we memorialise and who do we want to celebrate. And also, I'm always told I don't do this, but we've just written a book as well, which is called From Woolston to Colston, which is a 1,000-year history of slavery and abolition in Bristol. And my co-author has told me I've got to tell you that. So that's it, really. Anyway, I'll stop sharing, if that's all right.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roger. Sorry, did I interrupt you there? Were you going to say something more?
No, that's it. I'll get up now.
that was absolutely fascinating. Lots of new information there, and a very successful campaign. It's quite a job to try and rewrite history, isn't it? Because history is usually, they fought hard to bring over their version of history, the elite and the establishment. And that's, of course, we're made to believe that that's a fact, what we read in the history books, when it's in fact, it's their facts, it's not our facts. And it's a very important job you're doing, questioning that history. So it's a really excellent campaign that we can all learn from. So I think now Kevin is going to look at Churchill and I believe also the ideological issues behind those campaigns.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger. I can see from the comments that lots of people found that very informative, and I did. I learned a lot about Colston from that. What I'm going to talk about is perhaps a little wider, some of the lessons of the debate around the statues, and particularly why they do seem to raise so much emotion, and particularly this idea of tradition and really what these symbols mean. Rather opportunistically, I tacked on Churchill because of the Churchill statue, but it's also to remind people that next week I will be doing a talk on Churchill and anti-fascism and the Second World War. But the events surrounding statues that followed on from Colston, and in particular the campaign to defend Churchill, Baden-Powell, and a whole host of statues, has engendered a lot of comment Indeed, not only have politicians got involved and the press and so on, but there's even been threats of severe jail sentences, 10 years for defacing statues, as well as the predictable outrage. And I want to perhaps try and talk about why that outrage occurred, and particularly about the way that this idea that Roger explained very well, the invention of tradition. If you walk around any city or any town, you'll see a whole series of statues, and unless you're a real history buff or a tourist, you'll probably just walk past them. And if you live there, you'll walk past them every day, and indeed, you will probably hardly notice them. I think the interesting thing about Colston in Bristol was all the other activity that went on. I know of few other places where a local figure, or indeed a national figure, is celebrated in that way. In Belfast and in Northern Ireland, we've got the Orange Order, which carry out similar sorts of commemorations, have similar sorts of memorials about William III. But in general, in Britain, this is fairly rare. So we, I think, need to understand that when the statues are erected, and indeed when the narratives are constructed, they're done for a purpose. And indeed, the reaction of many people in the media to the campaign was to say that leftists and radicals, Marxists, even worse, I think, terrorists were trying to eradicate our history, were trying to destroy something. And I think that, there are two sort of conflicting ideas here. History has always been a very important part of the educational curriculum. When education developed as a mass form in many European countries in the late 19th and 20th centuries, history was one of the important parts of the curriculum. And if you look at the history curriculum in countries as different as France and Germany and Britain, you'll see similar elements in it. And this is particularly a national story. And the national story usually focuses around certain heroes who embody the nature of that nation. And this was very clearly an attempt to create a sense of national identity. Many of the new countries of Europe had a very flimsy sense of themselves. And so the state and the capitalist class in particular saw history as a way of binding people to that state, making them feel that they were members of the nation. And in particular in Britain, the sense of an imperial tradition, and particularly great explorers, people who go out and discover countries, as Roger referred to there, John Cabot, but other imperial heroes, people who have largely faded now, but for those of us an older generation, Clive of India, General Wolfe on the heights of Abraham, fighting the French General Montcalm in Quebec, the story of the British Empire unfolded. So that's, I think, the easy part of the narrative, and it's the clearer part of the narrative. But that narrative, and particularly that invented tradition, can change. And I think what we have to be, I suppose, very aware of is that narratives of ruling classes do shift. And so when you have a local example like Colston in Bristol, that narrative, in a sense, does link to a very important theme in the history of the city. But Roger was quite correct to point out it's not just that the statue exists, but when the statue was put up, when the narrative was constructed. And that narrative was, in a sense, an older narrative in Bristol. It was a narrative that fitted in with British capitalism and the British Empire in the 19th century, late 19th century. Is the narrative the same? And this is where I think the issue of tradition and emotion becomes so important, because we have another narrative, and this is perhaps where Churchill comes in. Churchill is known to many of us on the left as one of the most viciously anti-working class leaders of the Conservative Party. His record as Home Secretary before the First World War, dealing with industrial disputes, such as the miners' strike in Tonypandy, his attitude to the general strike, his attitude to the working class, his personal racism, anti-Semitism, all I think are very well known. And indeed for Labour activists who would have been around in the 40s and 50s, certainly people of my parents' generation, if you mention the word Churchill, it would be met with either a spit or a curse. He was a very hated figure, and indeed when he died in 1965, there were several parts of the country which refused to commemorate that. So Churchill was a very contested figure. He was a very divisive figure. What is interesting is that Churchill, as we've moved further away from the 1960s when he died, has become, I think, canonized in a very similar way to Colston. But in other words, a statue's gone up of him, I think relatively recently, certainly within the last 20 years, and a cult of Churchill has been strengthened and developed. So much so that when arguments were made that the Churchill statue would be pulled down or it would be attacked in some way, this led to an outcry, and in particular, it was seen as an attack upon Britishness. It was seen as an attack upon a national hero, a figure who embodied all that was best in us. I think the best example of this this type of hero worship was the Conservative MP Mark Francois, who's not noted for his grasp of history, who said in response to these protests that he'd like to get the protesters and say to them, you should watch the film Their Finest Hour, which is a sort of a very imaginative biopic about Churchill in 1940. It's so imaginative that it has him going on a tube train. There's no historical record he ever went on a tube train, much less in the war. And he has a conversation with a cross-section of the British population, who again include your usual mixture, but also significantly someone who is black. Now, I think this presentation of Churchill, both in that film and in the presentation of him as a national hero, is different to the presentation of Colston. It's different but similar. And this, I think, alerts us to the way that interpretations of history can change. Not just academic history, where more evidence comes to light, or where people like Roger do some excellent research to find out the truth about historical figures, but also can ideologically shift. And the shift I want to record here in terms of Churchill is Churchill as the great anti-fascist, as Churchill as the anti-racist, or at least the anti-Nazi, the man who stood between Nazism and civilization. Now we know about Churchill's record, both before the war and after it, but what that does is to transform, to elide over many of the uncomfortable truths, not only about Churchill, but about the nature of British imperialism and indeed the nature of the Second World War. Because of course the Second World War has now become Britain's national myth. And that war, very much linked to the cult of Churchill, portrays Britain as anti-racist, as anti-fascist. Indeed, some of the debates about Colston were around the argument that Britain was one of the first countries to abolish slavery, that it had a proud record of defending rights throughout the world. And this was part of a bigger campaign, I suppose, not only to whitewash the British Empire and to argue that it was essentially a benevolent enterprise that brought schools and medical care and civilization and democracy throughout the world. It was also, I think, part of an attempt by our current ruling class, by contemporary British society, to, in a sense, whitewash their role, in a sense, to reinvent themselves. So the debates that we've seen around Colston haven't simply, I think, turned on a clear defense of Colston, or they've not simply turned on an argument that you know, that Britain was proud of its empire in the sort of sense that it was you know, we're proud of having been a slave-owning nation. We're proud of having conquered the world. It's a pride in British history, which is actually, and this is the Second World War, I suppose here, which is actually quite clearly anti-racist, anti-fascist, very pro-democratic. It's part of, I think, of a Whig history of Britain, which sees Britain as moving gradually through history to become a more democratic, to become a more multicultural, to become a fairer society. And in that, we have the Dark Ages, when, of course, everybody did slavery, when everybody was not progressive, until our present day. And a series of enlightened leaders and politicians, Churchill, of course, is this important figurehead, portray this role of British history as being one of relatively uninterrupted progress towards democracy and towards freedom. So this, I think, shows that history is a battleground. It's not just a battleground for historians, it's actually a battleground for all of us. And the idea of an invented tradition of developing national myths, which has been a very important part of education systems, as I said at the beginning, really continues to the present day. So it's much more subtle, I think, than simply arguing that our ruling class wants to defend the past. What they want to do is to defend the present. And the present that they want to defend is one in which Britain is an enlightened, tolerant society. And so their call, as it were, to defend Churchill is not to defend the Churchill of the empire, but it's to defend Churchill, the anti-racist. Indeed, if you look very carefully, and there was a degree of embarrassment about this earlier this year when they broadcast a speech that Churchill made on VE Day. And there was some debate about whether the speech was entirely appropriate, because of course the speech is pitched entirely in terms of the British Empire. It's pitched not as Britain, small Britain alone against the might of fascism. Churchill talks about how the empire stood together, and for him this was a war to defend the British Empire against a German imperialism. So this rewriting of history, I think, has continued, and it will continue as an area of debate. It will, I think, get much stronger, if anything, particularly because many people do question the myths. Many people are starting to look much more closely at what they've been taught. Just to conclude as well about the particular debate that occurred around Churchill and Colston and the statues, and why, for many people, even those who were, possibly of a liberal or not particularly pro-imperialist nature, why it exercised their attention so much. Roger referred to emotion and tradition. And I think that in politics, history, tradition, and symbols can be quite important. And what I think we have to remember is that for many people, it's quite easy to mobilize them and to project a sense that their own sense of the past and their own place within it is under attack. Moving across the Atlantic, Donald Trump quite recently made a speech at Mount Rushmore when he identified himself with an American tradition, with being American against, again, more Marxist terrorists who were trying to undermine American history. What I think we have to do on the left is to counter arguments of the type that are made by Donald Trump about American history. And America has got an absolutely brilliant revolutionary history, both in the 18th century, but all the way up. We have to counter the arguments from the right, from the ruling class, about the nature of our history. And the sort of thing that people like Roger has done in Bristol is a good example of that. But there are numerous other examples, not just of exposing the ruling class, their empire, their capitalist system. Look around your own city and see how many statues of so-called public benefactors. Find out about them, question them, look and see where they come from. This debate, though, is also important in turning us towards another aspect of history, which is our history. The history from below, the history not only just of the lives and the struggles of ordinary people, but also the struggles of our movement, of the struggles of the radical left, of the Labour movement historically. Those struggles have been written out of history as well. Roger referred to the statue as being probably an attempt to get Bristolians in the 1890s to coalesce around a figure. And that idea of coalescing, of rallying around the flag, particularly in times of crisis, has always been used by ruling classes. One of our jobs as historians is to counter that narrative, is to show what history really is about, not just the sufferings and the humiliations and the exploitations of working class people, whatever their color, the exploitations of empire and of capitalism, but also to show that people fought back. So that we have a job not just to recover the hidden history of our ruling class that they want to cover up. We also have a job to recover the history of our class in its fight for emancipation and its fight for freedom. That's the sort of hidden history that we really do need to bring out into the open.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was very good, and definitely a few issues there we should discuss. At the moment, I have nobody in the audience with a hand up, so please, if you want to contribute or ask a question or have a comment, oh, there's a few hands going up. But there's certainly a few issues we can discuss in this issue. Particularly fascinating, I thought, the idea how narratives can shift and how the writing of history is adapted depending on where the ruling class is going. And we did touch on this subject in a session a few weeks ago on the, is capitalism racist today, which certainly proved quite controversial. But the idea that Churchill, the anti-racist, is now brought up rather than Churchill, the slayer of the working class, etc. There's interesting questions. So if you could indicate, please, if you want to speak, and I'll promote you to a panelist, as it's called, and then I can bring you in, ask some questions, and we can bring the two speakers back in to sum up. Phil, if you could please switch on your video, and I can bring you in straight away. There you are. Hello.
Hi. How you doing? And hello, Kevin and Roger. Those were great talks. Now, I want to make a point. Some of this is conjecture, because some of it's a bit of a question for social history, and there's not a lot of evidence for it. But I kind of wanted to bring in this idea about myth-making. There's kind of a way that Colston's been used to make a myth about British attitudes to slavery, and to sort of normalise it and say that he was a product of his time. Now, the British, there wasn't slavery in Britain after about the 12th century, like Christianity taught against it, and Britain was the place in Europe where it really was wiped out, slavery. Spain practiced it in the 16th and 17th century, so close to Africa, they were using slaves in plantations in the south of Spain. France, there was slavery. Britain, there really wasn't. And we had the Peasants' Revolt that ended feudalism and ended serfdom. And then there was a court case in the 15th century, the 16th century under Elizabeth I, which made it clear there was no basis for slavery in British law. So these people who established the slave trade, they were going to the Caribbean to do something that wasn't acceptable in Britain. And it did come, when it became established, it did become, there came to be a small number of slaves in Britain, but they were never imported directly into Britain. These were people who'd been slaves in the Caribbean, and then families had brought them back to England with them. And there was about 70, there's a period of about 70 years where there were maybe a few hundreds black slaves in Britain. And then just before the abolition of the slave trade, there was another court case which said it's not enforceable in Britain. If you bring a slave to Britain, they're immediately free. So yeah, I mean, my point was that there's a bit of a thing with Colston. People say, oh, well, it was a product of his time. And I don't think he really was a product of his time. I don't think the average person in Britain ever thought this was acceptable. And there was kind of an idea that prisoners of war were put into forced labour. And that happened a lot across Europe. But it just seems a bit of a, as well as making a myth about the man, it seems to make a myth about the ordinary people and to kind of say he was a product of his time, and I think he was. But the class that were doing slavery was the same class that were exploiting the British working class, making people work in poorhouses and stuff. So it's hard to find evidence about this because it's about the attitudes of normal people who weren't really documented. But I'd really be interested to know if what you think about that. Thanks.
Very interesting question, Phil. Okay, Andrew Ward next, please. Oh, you're muted, Andrew. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, yep. Okay, comrades. No, I really think, I'm really pleased Kevin took on the narrative of history. There's two sayings that I've been brought up. I mean, I got a degree in history, didn't do very well at Queen's University because I found it very dry. I was very spoilt at Ruskin College. There's two sayings of history which I've always stuck to. There's one about those who don't learn the mistakes in the past, say the mistakes in the future. That's from the late David Irvine, Progressive Unionist Party. Very interesting saying that, you know what I mean? But also saying Ruskin College always taught me, and I was very we were talking about public history, and the late Raphael Samuel, he had the history workshops. And the saying he always said, those who control the past control the future. And I think that's very relevant to Labour movement. I'm really pleased the Labour Left Alliance has been doing these history webinars because this thing should have happened years ago when Corbyn first become leader. And I think you recognise that, the failing momentum not to do anything. But I think this is really, really important for the left because most of the left are complete ignorance about history. Really are. They only think, listen to what they think they know. But, and they have no time. And it's really, I've pushed these history webinars continuously, you know what I mean? But I do think it's really, really important to delve into that. And my last point about history, and I think we have to look at this, is like, who did what to who is only the skeleton of history. How people lived around that situation is the flesh. And I think we need to, the left needs to reclaim history a lot more than what we have been doing and learn from Ruskin College. And maybe in time, and also people, I mean, we're very glad to have someone like Kevin, who used to be a retired history professor. But it's the more we can learn about history, looking at the primary sources of history, I think it's quite key to these topics. So I haven't made every single history webinar, but I've been doing other things. But next few weeks I will do, because I'm really pleased we're looking broadly at history and how the working class can reclaim it. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you, Andrew. Comrades, if you want to indicate, please press the button that says raise hand and I can bring you in. There's also, if you don't want to get on screen, you can also put your question in the Q&A. There is a sort of comment in the chat, which is interesting point about modern slavery. There's the tell people that there's no slavery in the UK at the moment. Certainly something that the speakers might pick up, though I would have thought it's quite a different context compared to, your country, your place being raided, etc., and you're being taken away from your family by force. Nevertheless, there is certainly a phenomena called modern slavery. So if the speakers might want to get back on that. Okay, there's Matthew now. Next, please.
Hi, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is that okay? Is the sound okay?
Yeah, super.
All right, great. Got a problem. I actually managed to get the proper microphone this time. Yeah, I mean, I think it's good in talking about the history of particularly of the working class and the left, which of course the ruling class really does not wish to show anywhere, or in fact its own, the sort of rotten nature of its own history. I mean, if you look here in Glasgow, I mean, for instance, the largest and most significant workplace in Glasgow, which is Parkhead Forge, for well over 100 years, 150 years, is now an enormous flat site, and then in one corner there's a shopping centre. There was nothing to mark that this place meant anything to anybody. Or that in fact it changed the history of the city and its labour movement. I think there's a small plaque to mark the Red Friday, the 31st of January 1919 in George Square, when the workers marched in under the red flag to to try and preserve the 8-hour day, and were seen as being revolutionary, reasonably so. And you get things like obviously like sort of the famous Wellington statue, which of course is always pictured in Glasgow with the traffic cone on his head, which is quite appropriate because of course Wellington was hated in Glasgow for his opposition to the 1832 Reform Act and the vote. I think the interesting thing really also is particularly in the US, where it's even worse. I mean, for two things. I mean, one of course the sort of the methods of basically the ruling class using the Confederacy as a means of splitting the working class and reinforcing racism, particularly in the southern US states, in which they've basically been spent most of the 20th century, particularly whenever there was a civil rights movement, sticking up more and more statues of Confederate figures. And this didn't really start until the 1890s and gathered pace, through before the First World War and then the 1930s, and was still going on until the 1970s. They were still sticking up Confederate statues, which is clearly an effort to maintain a racist division of the working class on the part of the ruling class, quite a conscious one. And you can see that really, I mean, it's really important that the working class, a unified working class youth is now tearing these things down. And it seems unlikely that they will put up again. And they've started tearing them down all over the place and removing things like the Confederate flag out of Mississippi. I mean, you've heard the song Mississippi Goddam. I mean, it is like that. I mean, US society is really, I mean, it's appallingly racist. I mean, it's almost inconceivable from here. The other thing, of course, is that the amazing history of the US labour movement, which has been concealed. I mean, I know Eugene V. Debs' house is now a museum, and there are a few other monuments, but the sort of history of uprising of the working class and the building of organisations like the United Mine Workers or the CIO in the 30s are entirely absent, and it's that the fact that they want to obscure our own history of revolt and our own history of the working class and the left trying to work, trying to fight against oppression. That is really what we should point out first. I mean, I think obviously we should state the rotten nature of the ruling class, but we should also really state, look, things exist here because people fought for them and because people in many cases died for them, like for instance even the vote. I mean, it took 100 and some between the Chartists in the 1840s until after the First World War. It took nearly 100 years to extract the vote from these people, and people died as a result. And there's nothing really to say how that struggle went. I mean, they won't even give. They'll only allow statues to Pankhurst, for instance, who supported the First World War. They don't want the statue of Sylvia because she opposed the First World War. You know, the ruling class in that sense really does have a very, very long memory and is very afraid of exposing that history of the working class and of the left. And we should really do it. That should be our thing, is to say, right, okay, we have this history, you know, and this should be commemorated, and everybody should know about it. And that should be our, so for me, that's our prime point. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. We're certainly trying with our series of webinars. That's certainly the goal, educating ourselves on our history as well as how we're moving forward. Okay, I've got no more people from the floor, so I would bring in Roger now first, if that's okay. We're supposed to finish at 7:30. So you have 10 minutes if you want, or even 15, or less, whatever you prefer.
Well, there's some interesting points there. I mean, the first thing I'd say is I kind of slightly disagree with Phil's point at the start there. I mean, when we first started looking at, I mean, spent 3 or 4 years researching, you know, the history of Bristol and transatlantic slavery, and one of the key things that we wanted to do at the start was we use a term, we define a category, which is forced labour, right? So that category includes a lot of things. We're going to put so-called free labour under capitalism, let's say, or modern capitalism to one side, even though we know that's coerced as well, but it's coerced in a different way. So let's just take forced labour. What we would include in that is chattel slavery, debt peonage, serfdom, indentured labour, penal labour, and other kinds of what we would call bonded labour. Now, we don't do that to equalise their misery or to try and have a competition about misery, but it's really important to have that category in place in order to understand how transatlantic slavery or chattel slavery actually happened and why it happened. So I don't quite agree with Phil's position. I think the point about what Phil's saying is to say that sometimes the way people talk about British history is they talk about Britain thought this, or Britain did this, and that's somewhat ridiculous. I mean, he's quite right, Phil's saying, you know, some people actually organised slavery and had the money and wealth to be able to do that, and the political power to make sure it was protected or enforced, and a lot of other people didn't. I mean, this is class struggle, simply, or at least class difference, let's put it that way. So the key point is to say, well, where does transatlantic slavery come from? Well, actually, there was bonded labour was central to the exploitation of British colonies, whether they were in Ireland or in the Caribbean, where they started in Ireland actually and then went to the Caribbean. And that bonded labour was of different forms. So we know, for example, that if you look at, say, if you took somewhere like, I don't know, Jamaica or Virginia in 1620s, then you would have found all sorts of different kinds of people there. You would have found indentured labourers there. These are people who signed away 7 years of their life, you know, who signed that away with an X, you know, they can't read or write, and they're probably in absolute poverty as well. And so there's indentured labourers. You've got penal labourers. So, you know, we know about transportation. We know about how laws were used to, you know, to apply the death sentence. Everybody knows about, you know, somebody who was hanged for stealing a loaf of bread. Well, they're not wrong about that, but the point is, for every 19 people that were given the death sentence, 18 of them were transported into penal labour. So really, hanging was just the terror. What was really going on was lots of people were being turned into forced labourers. Thirdly, you've got, you know, the indigenous people already on those islands when they were invaded, and they initially tried to, you know, force them into labour or into slavery. But slavery developed, West African slavery developed for simple reasons, right? One, they couldn't actually get enough penal labourers. They couldn't get enough forced labourers out of Britain, whether they're indentured or not. And also, loads of people were kidnapped or spirited. Like, we know of whole shiploads of orphans that were just grabbed out of prisons and dragged off to the plantations. So if you went into a plantation in the 1630s in the Caribbean, it's very likely you would meet the following people all working together, you know, indentured labourers, penal labourers, West African enslaved people, all together, all thrown together on a plantation. And it took a while for the people who ran those plantations and the people who organised the slave trade to realise that that was a dangerous group of people to throw together. There were a number of revolts, and they were terrified of these groups of forced labourers of all different types, being, rising up against them. That did happen in Barbados, for example. It happened in a number of other places in 1741 in New York, for example. So there's different phases, and they develop hierarchies as a result of that. So they start to say to indentured labourers, right, we'll give them some land, give them a gun, and they can become overseers. So they create hierarchies in order to deal with this problem of revolt and resistance to slavery. But it's wrong to say that there were massive divisions between these people. That happened later on. Similarly, it's wrong to say that people went to Africa to buy West Africans because they were racists. They weren't racists, they were merchants, they were businessmen. And what was so attractive about going to West Africa, it's a long way to go, isn't it? To go and get people, if you can get them from Somerset. If you get from vagrants from Somerset, it's much easier. So why did they go to West Africa? Well, the reason is West Africa, you could buy people. You didn't have to go and hunt them down or capture them or anything. That didn't happen. What happened was you went to Africa and bought people, right? Now, that's something that we need to deal with when we look at transatlantic slavery. That's why it was so attractive. And there happened to be trade winds and things like that helped you get across the Atlantic. So there's a lot more to this slavery around the idea of forced labour. And also the point has been made, and quite correctly, if you were actually in a field in the 1630s as a forced labourer, right, whether you were indentured, or whether you were a penal labourer, the conditions weren't very different to being to being an enslaved African. The actual conditions were not different, really. And you could also be flogged and sold. They sold indentured labourers to each other. So that period in the 17th century now it does change. Now, don't get me wrong. The differences become larger and greater as time goes on. But the more positive point Phil's making, which I think is right, is to say that the idea that somehow these people were a product of their time at Colston, the merchant venturers in Bristol have pushed this argument for the last 30 years I've been in the city. Everybody did slavery. Everybody was at it. It was racist and we were all in it together and that's it. Now, why are they saying that? They're saying that because they're trying to say that everybody was involved in slavery. And actually that argument suited some activists on the left as well to say, or your liberal left to say, everybody was doing it. Well, that's really not the case. It really isn't the case to say that. In fact, it's much more complicated than that, and much more, there were class divisions. And in fact, your chances of being, if you're a poor working class or person in the 17th century, there was quite a high chance you might end up in the Caribbean for one way or another. So I think there are periods of history that change. There was always opposition to slavery. There was always opposition. It wasn't some bunch, I was always told when I was at school, it was a bunch of Wilberforce and a few posh people who kind of decided it was wrong for religious reasons. Complete nonsense. I mean, when you look at the history of it, if you want to argue, back in Bristol, we had the Bristol mob rising in the 11th century to attack slave traders. And, if you look at the English Civil War, you see the Levellers and all these sort of ideas and the nonconformists. Where does the abolitionist movement come from? Well, it comes from the English Civil War. So there's great, wonderful parts of British history which have been obscured. And there are political reasons, as Kevin has said, for doing that right now. And I think it's really interesting, Kevin's angle on that. The whole idea of we're all in it together. Well, we don't buy that historically. We really don't at Bristol Radicals. It's nonsense. Anyway, I'll shut up there, but I'll finish with that bit.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roger. It was definitely worthwhile inviting you along. I think we've all learned quite a lot. Thank you very much for this. Okay, Kevin, you got up to 20 minutes if you want them.
No, I think I might be a little less.
Actually, there is a question I've just seen. Shall I read it out quickly?
Yeah.
Okay, that's from Diana. There's an environmental aspect to imperialism, colonialism, slavery, bonded labor, etc. Yeah. Indigenous populations removed from land, then used for plantations, land cleared for cash to crops. People removed from the land that supported them and land used for cash crops, agricultural businesses. There's been accelerated soil degradation, and Cuban sugar plantations are a major example. The same happened across all of the Caribbean. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a springing that onto you. You don't have to reply to it if it's...
Okay, I'll think about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Roger was spot on in his reply on slavery. Although I noticed from the chat line there that Phil Pope has said that he was using slavery in a narrow sense. So I think you know, Rogers really made a very convincing case about this argument that we were all in it together, that everybody was conniving at slavery. There are some interesting points about the development of slavery in different countries in Europe. And although this very quickly turned into something different in Latin America, one of the things that's very interesting when the Spanish Empire began to develop in the early 16th century in Latin America, what would become Latin America, was that the Emperor Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, but also King of Spain at that point, actually tried to forbid the use of slavery. And he did so using the point that Roger made, using some Christian ideas that these were souls to be saved. And I think you'll also see that in some of those earlier periods, and this would also have been true of Britain, that monarchs, kings, nobility from these various territories were actually given equal status with European monarchs. In other words, when some of the rulers of the territories in Latin America came to Spain, they were treated as visiting royalty. And indeed, there's also evidence that even in the Elizabethan period, that nobility from Africa, for example, were accorded the same status. So this is a very simple way of saying, I think, that slavery is very much, and race, very much linked to class. And the history of slavery in the West Indies, you know, particularly with indentured laborers and prisoners and so on sent from Ireland, particularly in the 17th century, indicate that there is no sort of racist type of preference for Black people, that it's that as far as these exploiters are concerned, it's a case of using anybody and anybody in terms of you know, their race and whatever. And I think there's quite an important discussion here to be had about race and class, and that in fact that capitalists in this period were willing to exploit anybody, and indeed treated whole sections of the population as inferiors. So in a sense, capitalism and slavery have a very interesting relationship. And I think it's one that's worth bringing up, particularly because the arguments about social attitudes usually start from the viewpoint that Europeans saw all non-Europeans as inferiors. And I think that the issue is much more complex than that. Some of that is rooted in Christian ideology, but other aspects of it, I think, are to do with the early development of capitalism. I was interested in what Andrew said about History Workshop, and in particular the idea of history from below, and the sort of work that groups like Rogers have done in the terms of reclaiming history. But I think we've also got to be careful about the way that ruling classes are quite able to incorporate narratives, and that what we will not get today will be a simple defense of the exploitation and the imperialism of the past. We will get a much more subtle defense of it. Some of it may even involve the discourse that we're familiar with, which will be, you know, a hostility to racism, a hostility to slavery, but then point out the progressive nature, the fact that it was the British Empire and the British Navy that, quote, stopped slavery, the fact that enlightened governments and reformers, you know, Roger mentions Wilberforce, had all been active in this. So what this does is, it's the other side of the coin from saying everybody in the past supported slavery, indeed everybody benefited from slavery. It's the other side of the coin from that to say, of course, that certain countries and certain empires were progressive. And again, it's another type of justification for the status quo. I remember a few years ago when he was a Minister or Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove giving a quick resume on a discussion program about British history as being a series of enlightened reforms which a benevolent series of ruling classes gave out to the masses. And this completely left aside the type of history that Roger pointed out. I know Bristol famously for the Reform riots. I now know more about it in terms of slavery, but I'd like people to see Bristol's history as being both the exploitation of slavery by its ruling class, but also the resistance of its great democratic traditions in terms of the Reform riots. Tony Benn, when he was the MP for Bristol South East, made a lot of that, and I think that sort of tradition in the Labour movement of reusing and bringing our own history to the fore, I think is quite important in that way. One last point about, I think, the sort of narrative of history, particularly history around us, and it's about, I suppose, the space and the world and what that represents. If you go to many cities, you will increasingly see monuments, often informal or the products of local groups that celebrate different aspects of the city. In Preston, for example, there's a very interesting modernist style statue about the Chartist General Strike in 1842, which shows soldiers, a row of soldiers shooting down strikers. So that, in a sense, is a challenge to the narrative about Preston's history. But it also brings up a wider idea about who controls our space, who decides that those monuments are going to be there. You know, Colston was put up because of the ruling elite in Bristol wanted a figurehead. They wanted someone, you know, to be the public face of their city. And notice it was their city because in 1895, most people didn't have a local government vote, and it's only much later, in fact, it's even in many ways until after the Second World War that the property, the ratepayer franchise is changed. So the issue of who determines the space, who says that this statue should be here, but that shouldn't be, or that protest should be here, but that one is illegitimate, are, I think, quite important, questions. And in many ways, in pulling down the statue, you're talking about who controls that space, and above all, who controls the narratives about Bristol. So it's an interesting debate, I think, about the place of history. I think that as comrades like Matthew and Andrew have drawn attention to, it's not just something that should be confined to historians or even to radical history groups. It's something that should really come out into the general population. I've been interested in history since I was at primary school, and I've always had a great sense of continuity. I am one of those people who walks around cities, looks up at the buildings and wonders how they got there and who built them and so on. But I have another sense as well about history, and that's change. And Phil and Roger and other comrades who came in this evening made the point that history is about change. We do not live in the same world as Edward Colston. We also don't live in the same world as the merchant venturers who put the statue up. And the reason why we don't live in that world, there are any number of forces that have shifted that, but one of the important forces is in fact the struggle of working class people, the struggle of the labour movement. So the struggle for the right to vote, the struggle for education, the struggle for all sorts of social amenities is a product of historical struggle. And if we don't learn anything else from history, it's simply that things change. And the reason why they change is that we want them to change. Men and women make their own history, not under circumstances of their own choosing maybe, but they certainly make it. And that's why teaching history shows us that things have not always been like this, and things will not always be like this if we want them to be other. Thanks.
How you managed to sum up so well always. Well done. Well done, Kevin. It sounded slightly familiar. I think you were quoting a certain Karl Marx there, was it? I think I recognized it. Anyway, that was a fascinating session. I really enjoyed it. And judging by the monumental comments in the chat sessions there as well, people enjoyed it immensely and have volunteered you for more sessions, of course. But we're trying to get some other speakers. So there's been suggestions made to have a session on the levelers, the diggers, the ranters as well. John Littleburn versus Oliver Cromwell's English Civil War. There's so much we should discuss, and you know, I hope we can keep up our LLA 2 weekly webinars to discuss some sessions.
Tina, I do know some comrades who've done work on that, particularly on the diggers, and particularly Gerard Winstanley. I'll try and rope them in. I mean, I'm very keen on the diggers and the levelers. It was something, you know, strangely for someone of my age, they made a lot of it in school, and I did a lot of work on it for my A levels. So yeah, I'll try and get you someone.
Could I just make a point there, Tina?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, John Rees has just reviewed this book. It's just come out, which I think you can see is called Regicidal Revolution,
right.
By Nora Carlin, who would be great to get on if she'd be up for doing it, I think. But why it's a very important book, it's just come out, is it's all of the depositions made from all over the country by units of the New Model Army, or people who were involved at the point where Charles I is going on trial. So it's a real sample of the history of below of soldiers in the New Model Army and ordinary people about what they thought the future of Britain should be, and particularly around, you know, rights and the changes that were going to occur. Very great book, just came out. Nora, I'm sure, will be right up for speaking about it. John Rees has just reviewed it, and he's a mate of hers.
Can you hold it up again?
Roger.
Well, Regicidal, I've got to get it right.
Regicidal Revolution, yeah.
Regicidal Revolution by Nora Carlin, just out this year. Breviary stuff, it is, the publisher. But it's a wonderful book to read because it's primary sources that are annotated. So you can actually read what people were saying in 1649. So. Yeah.
Excellent. Sounds very good. Thank you for that. Also, some comrades have suggested that the format of having Kevin with another guest speaker works very well. I agree. I think we might keep that going.
Nice.
Thank you very much, Roger and Kevin. That was a great session. Brilliant event, comrades. Somebody just commented. I agree. We'll put the video up for many more people to enjoy both of your knowledge. We've got next week. Kevin, can you tell us what you're doing next week?
Yes, it's I'm looking at Churchill, imperialism and the Second World War. So some of the themes that I talked about Churchill will come up there, but it's looking at how we present how the Second World War is presented to us, and I'm going to talk about, you know, other interpretations of it as an imperialist war, and to try and strip away some of the patriotic mythology. But it's, you know, very similar. I'll try and bring along a straight man or woman next week, so there'll be another person if you want.
Excellent. Sounds good. Thank you very much, comrades. That was a hugely enjoyable session. Have a good evening. Speak to you soon.